New York City Police Department sergeant shot and killed a 66-year-old mentally disturbed woman in her Bronx apartment last week. And since then, questions on why the officer used lethal force instead of a taser are now being asked. Police say Sergeant Hugh Barry entered Deborah Danner's apartment on Pugsley Avenue in the Castle Hill section of the Bronx, where she was holding a pair of scissors, threatening them. After responding to a neighbor's complaint, the officers convinced Danner to drop the scissors, but afterwards, she grabbed a bat and swung it at police. Sergeant Barry, an 8-year veteran of the department in the 43rd precinct, I should say, fired 2 shots from his gun, hitting her in the torso, and Danner died later that evening at Jacoby Hospital. Police Commissioner James ONeill stated, quote, "We do have policies and procedures for handling emotionally disturbed people, and it looks like some of those procedures weren't followed. What is clear in this one stance is we failed." Police, or I should say Mayor Bill de Blasio, also said deadly force should only be used, quote, in dire situations, stating that the shooting of Deborah Danner is tragic and never should have happened. It's as simple as that. Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. criticized the officer, saying, quote, "This elderly woman was known to the police department, yet the officer involved in the shooting failed to use the discretion to either talk her down from her episode or, barring that, to use his stun gun." Now, the officer involved in the shooting has been placed on modified duty, stripped of his shield and gun, until the case is completely investigated by the Chief of Public Integrity by the Bureau from the Bronx District Attorney's Office. Now, here to tell us about the possible outcome of the case, we welcome now defense attorney from the Bronx criminal lawyers, Alexander Sanchez. And Alexander, good to have you back again.
How are you? Good to be here.
Good to be here. And as we talk about this, once again, a disturbing case that really has got the borough up in arms. And more importantly, this officer does have a history, allegedly, of brutality.
You know, it's a very troubling case, and this has all the elements of a major controversy without any easy resolution. We have mental illness involved. We have an armed police officer. We have a dead woman who's an elderly person. There was the possibility that limited use could have been used, such as the stun gun, or they were going to wait for the EMS. The question I have is whether or not this officer is going to be charged. Now remember, he or maybe another officer was the only person that was in the room at that time. Those are the witnesses, because she's dead, right? She can't testify. And they're going to testify, well, you know, I was facing deadly force. This is what the defense is going to say. I'm telling you that right now. I was facing deadly force. You see, let's say you were walking down the street and a man was a half a block away threatening you with a baseball bat. I'm going to kill you. You have a right to run. You have a duty to try to run away. Get in a car and leave. Call the police if you can. Police officers do not have a duty to run away from deadly force. We're paying the police to go into and confront the possibility of deadly force. That's going to be their argument, that he was in that place and he was facing deadly force, and he needed to defend himself. Whether or not that's going to succeed or not, that remains to be seen.
What are we seeing in terms of, we've heard from Police Commissioner James ONeill saying some procedures were not followed. You've heard the mayor out and out condemn this, the borough president actually speaking and condemning this as well. When you have leaders at this level speaking so, forcefully at this, does this have any weight moving forward?
I think it does have weight because it influences those powers within the city that are investigating this, and they have to ultimately answer to the people of the Bronx or the people of the city of New York. But this case, I don't think is quite as clear cut as what people believe. It sounds horrible. Police officers go into somebody's house, they shoot an old lady dead. What I've seen and the reports that I've seen is that this woman had, over a long period of time, been acting very erratic, had been making very violent statements in her apartment, been kicking things around. And there was an interview by some next door neighbor, and they asked her, what did you think about this? And her opinion was, well, I'm thinking maybe the police officers were justified here. I don't know, but you can be certain the defense is going to call these people as witnesses to show that she had extremely violent tendencies up to that point. And when the police officer entered into that place, he's going to say, well, not only did she have a history of violent tendencies, she tried to use violence against me, and what am I going to do? That is going to be his argument.
It is very hard in this city, and we've talked about this on this show several times, very hard to convict a police officer. We know that there have been clear and compelling evidence. In many other instances, when you have a situation like this where the evidence isn't that clear and compelling, It does raise a lot of questions as to which direction this will actually go.
Listen, there's two lines of investigation. One is the criminal investigation. The second one is whether or not he violated departmental policies, which I think he did, because he went up to that apartment, and there's an old lady in a room. Why couldn't he leave the old lady in the room and lock the door, let's say, until the EMS came? Why couldn't he do that? Why couldn't he use his stun gun? Why couldn't he wait for the EMS specialist to come, or use some other method, or even charge her and knock her down when she was perhaps not holding some type of weapon? He could have done that. And maybe this will result in him being fired from the police department or some other disciplinary action. That's a separate question of whether or not he's going to be charged criminally. Mm-hmm. Because a police officer or anybody has a right to use deadly force if they feel that deadly force is being used against them and they have no alternative.
Right. Let's break this down, because there are criminal charges that could possibly be filed. Right. And then you also have departmental trial and departmental charges right now. Right. With the case of the criminal charges, should the Bronx District Attorney at this point be filing charges?
The Bronx District Attorney should be investigating this case. That's what they should be doing. They should be investigating, taking evidence from witnesses, taking evidence from the fellow police officers, from the medical examiner's office, from any available source. Once they have all that information, they will sit down with their supervisors there and determine whether or not this is the type of case that should be presented to a grand jury, because the grand jury is the only one that could actually file felony charges against anybody. The district attorney initially files charges, but only the grand jury can file formal charges. And so they have to make that decision. If they file the case before a grand jury has the option of filing charges of murder or manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide or assault, or not filing charges at all.
Let's talk about the police department. Departmental trial, obviously, Police Commissioner James ONeill saying in that statement that we showed here that some procedures were not followed. Is the commissioner already tipping his hand that this is already egregious?
No, I think he is. I mean, to make that statement this early in the investigation based upon the information that he knows, I think he's tipping his hand and indicating that they're going to file charges in the police department and try to get this officer disciplined. You know what the main problem is, Daren, is that when mental illness comes in conflict with the criminal justice system, it never has a positive ending. It doesn't have a positive ending, or usually does not have a positive ending, when the police come in conflict with somebody who has mental illness. It doesn't have a positive ending when the person is arrested and now they're in the criminal justice system. How do you handle people with mental illness? Do you treat them the same as everybody else?
Right, so is this, which many people are saying right now, city leaders, community leaders are saying, listen, there's this huge gap when it talks about dealing with criminals and people who have mental illness. When are we going to be able to bridge that gap? And does this case, once again, highlight the fact that we have huge flaws when it comes to mental illness?
I can tell you from personal experience, and I've been doing this for almost 36 years, that when dealing with mentally health challenged individuals is extremely challenging. There are very few programs in the criminal justice system to deal with people with mental health issues. There's only a handful, and the ones they do have, they don't want to take people that are violent. They want to take people that are very subdued. They may have mental problems, but they want people that are very subdued. And what about the community? How many mental health facilities or treatment centers or psychiatrists or social workers are available for people with mental health problems? There's not that many. And so it lingers and it grows and it festers, and it ends up in situations like this.
And it has to be some reform definitely coming down the pike. Do you see, what do you see by way of the community? Obviously, community's outraged. We've seen city leaders out there. We've seen some protests already taking place. But with the fact that the commissioners come out, spoken about this and said, listen, you know what, some procedures may not have been followed. The mayor spoken, the borough president has spoken. Does this do something better in the midst of it all between police-community relations when you have them being so outspoken on the front end?
Well, I think it does. And I think there's going to be a push for all the local police precincts to be much more aware, or to go for training when you're dealing with people with mental health problems. You can't treat people with mental health problems the way you treat criminals. These are two different classes of people. This woman wasn't a criminal. She was an old, sick person. Now, she may have swung a bat that day, but she didn't have a history of being a violent felon. They need to be trained on how to deal with people like this. Maybe they need different equipment to come on. Maybe they need to come in with something which they can immediately, like a net or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a police officer. I'm not an expert at their procedures. But they definitely need to engage in new procedures to deal with people like this so that an old lady with mental health issues doesn't end up dead.
And certainly we'll be following this case as the time goes on. Where does it go from here?
Where it goes from here is there's going to be a couple of investigations going on. You have the investigation by the Bronx District Attorney's Office, as we said. You have the investigation by the New York City Police Department. They're going to be preparing charges against the police officer. There may be possibly a federal investigation for violating this woman's civil rights that will probably be later on after all the state investigations are conducted. This office is not working, but he's being paid. And let me tell you something, and I've said this before, when officers get in trouble, whether or not they've done something very egregious or whether or not they've made a mistake, they get very fine legal representation. They get a whole slew of lawyers over there. How do I know that? Because I know all these guys. And they get medical experts, and they get investigators and photographers and people to review autopsy reports, and they get any type of resources you could possibly want. Compare that to the ordinary person in the Bronx who gets in trouble, who's scrambling around to get legal representation. They're treated differently, and they're treated better, and that's simply a fact of life.
Alexander Sanchez, expert criminal defense attorney with us here, sharing with us from the Bronx Criminal Lawyers. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Great to be here.
All righty, listen, we got to take a quick break, switching gears, and when we come back, we will tell you who is preparing for their next re-election bid next year and where we are in the race to the White House. Please don't go anywhere. We're coming right back in just a few.